I never thought a simple knock on my door would change everything. When I opened it, there he stood, my neighbor, eyes filled with something I wasn't ready to name. He only wanted sugar, or at least that's what I told myself. But as I invited him in, the air between us thickened, heavy with unspoken words and forbidden thoughts. One moment of weakness, one reckless decision, and suddenly, my world was teetering on the edge. What happens when temptation is too strong to resist? Keep watching to see where this dangerous attraction leads. The knock came just as I was finishing my coffee, the warm ceramic mug cradled between my palms as I stood by the kitchen window. Outside, the afternoon sun cast golden streaks across the manicured lawns of our quiet suburban street. It was the kind of day that felt unremarkable, until I opened the door. There he was, Jake, my neighbor. His dark hair was tousled as if he'd just run a hand through it. A faint smirk tugged at his lips, an expression I had seen countless times in the last few years. He was younger than my husband, 5 years my junior, and carried himself with the kind of effortless confidence that made it impossible not to notice him. "Hey," he said, leaning against the doorframe with an easy charm. "Got any sugar?" A simple request. A harmless question. And yet something about the way he said it made my pulse skip a beat. I swallowed, forcing myself to smile. "Yeah, of course, come in." He stepped inside, and suddenly the walls of my home felt smaller, the space between us shrinking. He had been in my house before, small neighborly favors, casual drop-ins, but today felt different. Maybe it was the fact that my husband was out of town, away on a business trip like he so often was. Maybe it was the way Jake's eyes lingered on me just a little too long as I moved toward the pantry. Or maybe it was me. Maybe it was the way I had started to crave those lingering glances. I grabbed the sugar jar and turned, only to find him standing much closer than I expected. I nearly bumped into him, my breath catching in my throat as my body reacted to his proximity. He smelled faintly of cologne and something warm, something distinctly male. "Didn't mean to startle you," he murmured, his voice lower now, quieter. I let out a nervous laugh, though nothing about the way my heart pounded felt funny. "You didn't?" His gaze flicked down to my hand as I passed him the sugar jar. Our fingers brushed, just a brief, fleeting touch, but it sent a shiver down my spine. It was ridiculous. This was nothing, a neighborly exchange, a coincidence. Except it wasn't. Not when I had caught him watching me so many times before. Not when I had let myself wonder, late at night, what it would feel like if he ever crossed that invisible line between us. "So," he said, breaking the silence, "what are you up to today?" I hesitated, gripping the counter behind me as if I needed the support. "Nothing much, just a quiet afternoon. Alone." That single word hung between us, thick with implication. I nodded slowly. "Yeah, my husband's away for work." Jake's smirk deepened, but he said nothing. He didn't have to. The tension in the air was doing all the talking for us. I knew I should step back. I knew I should make some excuse, usher him out, let this moment dissolve before it became something dangerous. But I didn't. Instead, I stayed. Instead, I let the silence stretch, let the charged energy between us grow heavier. And I let myself wonder, just for a second, what would happen if I stopped pretending I didn't want this. Jake leaned against the counter, the jar of sugar still in his hand, though neither of us seemed concerned with it anymore. His eyes never left mine. And I knew that if I didn't cut this moment short, it would spiral into something I wouldn't be able to take back. I should have moved. I should have stepped away, made some excuse about needing to get back to my day, but I didn't. Instead, I stood there, gripping the counter behind me, letting the silence stretch between us. "You sure you're okay?" he asked after a beat, his voice smooth, laced with something deeper, something darker. Mm, yeah, I said quickly, maybe too quickly, just lost in thought. He tilted his head, studying me. Dangerous thing, that. I forced a small laugh, but it was thin, barely there. What is... Thinking too much. The way he said it, slowly, deliberately, made my stomach tighten. I shouldn't have enjoyed this. I shouldn't have felt this sudden rush of exhilaration, this breathless kind of nervousness that made my skin feel too hot, too tight. But I did. God help me, I did. I swallowed, forcing myself to break eye contact. I turned toward the sink, needing something, anything, to ground me, to pull me back to the safe, predictable rhythm of my life. But Jake wasn't done. So, he said, setting the sugar jar down on the counter with a soft clink. You planning on spending the whole day cooped up in here? I shrugged, trying to keep my voice light. I had some reading planned, maybe a little cleaning. He let out a small hum, stepping closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating off his body. Exciting. I turned to look at him, arching a brow. And what about you? Baking, he said, smirking. I snorted, unable to help myself. You don't bake. He placed a hand over his chest in mock offense. That's unfair, you don't know that. I rolled my eyes. Jake, I've seen you survive off takeout and gas station snacks for the last 3 years. The only time your oven gets used is when your sister visits. He laughed, and the sound was too easy, too warm, slipping under my skin in a way I wasn't prepared for. All right, you got me, he admitted. It's for my sister. She's making something for her boyfriend, and I told her I'd help. Huh? I teased. So you're just the errand boy. Pretty much, he said, shrugging. But hey, if it gets me a batch of cookies out of the deal, I'm not complaining. I smiled despite myself. It was easy with him. Too easy. And that was the problem. I glanced toward the door, knowing I should end this, knowing I should push him out before I let my mind wander too far. But then he did something I wasn't expecting. He reached out, brushing the edge of my sleeve between his fingers. It was the lightest touch, barely there, but it sent every nerve in my body sparking to life. My breath caught. I like this color on you, he murmured, his gaze locked on mine. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Jake, he tilted his head slightly. Tell me to leave. My mouth opened. The words were right there. I could say them. I could laugh this off, push him away, pretend that this moment wasn't unraveling everything. But I didn't. I stood there, my skin buzzing where he touched me, my breath shallow, my heart slamming against my chest like it was trying to warn me, run, run, run. But I didn't, because I didn't want to. The air between us grew thicker, charged with something I couldn't name, something I didn't dare name. Rest, I should go, he said after a moment, though his hand hadn't moved. I nodded, but my body screamed at me to do something, to break the rules, and to give in. Then, without thinking, I whispered, "You don't have to." The moment those words left my lips, everything shifted. His expression changed. His teasing smirk vanished, replaced by something hotter, heavier. I saw the exact second his restraint snapped. And then he kissed me. It wasn't slow, wasn't gentle. It was desperate, urgent, like he'd been waiting for this moment just as long as I had. My back hit the counter and I gasped against his mouth, my fingers tangling in his shirt. It was reckless. It was dangerous. And it was everything. For the first time in years, I felt a weight. For the first time in years, I wasn't just a wife or a woman waiting for her husband to come home to a predictable, safe life. I was something wild, something alive, and I didn't want to stop. Not yet. Not ever. Jake's hands found my waist, pulling me against him with a hunger that sent a shock of heat down my spine. His lips moved against mine with an urgency I hadn't felt in years, as if we had been waiting for this moment for far too long. I should have stopped it. I should have pulled away, shaken my head, laughed it off. Anything but this. But I didn't, because the truth was, I didn't want to. The rational part of me screamed that this was wrong, that this was dangerous, but my body was already betraying me. My fingers gripped the fabric of his t-shirt, pulling him closer instead of pushing him away. God, he muttered against my lips, his breath ragged. You have no idea how long I've wanted to do that. My heart slammed against my ribs, because I knew exactly how long I had. Because I had felt it too. It had always been there, lingering just beneath the surface. The way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't watching. The way our conversations were always a little too easy, our eye contact a little too long. The way I craved the attention he gave me. Attention I no longer got from my husband. I swallowed hard, trying to catch my breath. We can't. Jake didn't move away. His forehead rested against mine, his fingers still gripping my hips as if he couldn't bring himself to let go. I know, he said quietly. But do you want me to? That question nearly broke me, because I could have ended this right then and there. I could have lied. I could have said yes, told him this was a mistake, that we were just caught up in the moment. But I didn't. Instead, I let the silence answer for me. His thumb brushed the curve of my hip, the small motion sending a shiver up my spine. My breath came in shallow gasps as I tried to ignore the way my body leaned into him, despite every warning flashing in my head. We're going to regret this, I whispered. He smirked, his lips dangerously close to mine. Then let's make it worth it. His mouth crashed against mine again, this time deeper, more deliberate. I gasped as he lifted me onto the counter, his hands gripping my thighs. My body arched instinctively, my legs parting just enough for him to step between them, closing the distance until I could feel everything. I should have cared about what this meant. But right now, with his lips trailing down my neck, his hands mapping out places that had been ignored for far too long, I couldn't bring myself to care about anything but him. The dangerous turn. The world outside didn't exist anymore. Not the guilt. Not my husband. Not the consequences that were bound to come crashing down eventually. Right now it was just Jake. Just the way his lips burned against my skin, the way his hands knew exactly where to touch, the way I was coming undone at just the sound of his ragged breath. I tilted my head back, letting out a soft sigh as his mouth moved lower, his fingers gripping the hem of my top. A sudden noise from outside snapped me back to reality. I stiffened instantly, my breath catching in my throat. Jake must have felt it because he pulled back slightly, searching my face. "What's wrong?" he asked. I glanced toward the window. The faint sound of a car door slamming shut sent my pulse into a frantic race. No. My husband wasn't supposed to be home until tomorrow. Panic seized my chest. "Jake, you need to go. Now." He hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Wait, I pushed against his chest, urgency clawing up my throat. "Now." He caught on quickly. In one swift motion, he stepped back, running a hand through his hair as he glanced around. "Where?" "Blah." "The back door," I whispered, already sliding off the counter and straightening my clothes. He nodded, moving fast, careful not to make a sound as he slipped toward the back of the house. My hands were shaking as I tried to fix my hair, my lips still tingling from his kisses. The front door clicked open. I sucked in a breath, forcing my face into an expression of calm before I turned around. There he was, my husband, standing in the doorway, suitcase in hand, his eyes scanning the room. I swallowed hard, praying he didn't see the guilt painted all over my face. "Hey," I said, my voice sounding too high, too tight. "You're home early." He smiled, dropping his bag near the door before walking toward me. Yeah, the conference wrapped up sooner than I thought. His arm slipped around my waist, pulling me into a hug. The scent of his cologne hit me. The same scent I had grown used to over the years. The same scent that suddenly felt wrong, because it wasn't Jake's. I let him hold me, my pulse hammering as I forced myself to relax, forced myself to push away the lingering sensation of another man's hands on my body. "What were you up to?" he asked, pulling back slightly. I wet my lips, scrambling for something, anything that sounded normal. "Oh, just," I gestured vaguely toward the kitchen. "Just cleaning up. Jake stopped by for a bit. He needed sugar for baking." The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them, because his eyes narrowed just slightly. And I knew he could tell something was off. I forced a smile, praying he wouldn't press any further. "How was the trip?" For a long moment, he just stared at me. Then, slowly, his expression softened. "It was fine," he said, his voice light. "Missed you, though." I exhaled, relieved. Missed you too." But as I leaned in to kiss him, my stomach twisted. Because for the first time in my marriage, I wasn't telling the truth. And the worst part? I wasn't sure if I regretted it. For the next few days, I did everything I could to push the memory of what happened with Jake out of my mind. I threw myself into household chores, cleaned out the guest room for no reason, organized cabinets that didn't need organizing, anything to distract myself. But nothing worked, because no matter what I did, I could still feel him. The ghost of his touch lingered on my skin, the memory of his lips on mine playing on a never-ending loop in my mind. And then, on Wednesday afternoon, he texted me. "Jake still got sugar?" I stared at the screen for a long time, my heart pounding. He wasn't just talking about baking supplies. He was testing me, seeing if I'd let him back in, if I wanted more. And God help me, I did. I knew I should have ignored it. I knew I should have deleted the message, put my phone down, and gone about my day like a faithful wife. But instead, my fingers betrayed me. "Me? Depends. You planning on returning what you borrowed?" The reply came almost instantly. "Jake, I think I still owe you something." A shiver ran down my spine. I knew what he meant, and I knew exactly what I was about to do. The invitation. An hour later, he was standing at my front door again. I opened it, my pulse hammering in my throat. Unlike last time, he didn't ask for permission to come inside. He stepped in without hesitation, closing the door behind him, his body so close to mine that I could feel the warmth radiating off him. "Tell me to leave," he murmured, his breath brushing against my cheek. I wouldn't. Instead, I reached for him, tangling my fingers in his shirt, pulling him in before I lost my nerve. Our lips met in a frenzied kiss, the kind of kiss that shouldn't exist, that should have stayed buried in the realm of forbidden thought. But we weren't thinking anymore. There was no hesitation this time. No moment of pause, no second guessing. Jake lifted me off my feet, pressing me back against the wall, his hands gripping my thighs as my legs wrapped around his waist. I gasped against his lips, my fingers fisting in his hair, my body burning with the kind of reckless hunger I hadn't felt in years. Maybe ever. "We shouldn't," I whispered. But the words held no real conviction. Jake smirked against my skin. "Then stop me." I didn't. Crossing the line. Somehow we stumbled into the living room, hands desperate, clothes pushed aside but not completely removed. There was something even more dangerous about the way we couldn't even bother making it to a bedroom. This wasn't about romance. It wasn't about whispered confessions or long, lingering gazes. This was pure need. Raw, unfiltered. Jake's hands roamed over my body, his breath uneven, his lips tracing a path down my neck, over my collarbone, lower, and I let him. I let him take everything. I let myself forget. Forget that I was Mary. Forget that there would be consequences. Forget that my husband trusted me. For those stolen moments, there was no husband. There was no future. There was only Jake and me and this intoxicating, devastating hunger that refused to be ignored. The aftermath. When it was over, we lay there in the aftermath, tangled in each other, our breath still uneven. The reality of what we had done should have hit me like a freight train, but it didn't, because all I could think about was how alive I felt. I turned my head to look at Jake, my fingers absent-mindedly tracing circles on his chest. His eyes were already on me, watching. "Tell me you regret it," he murmured. I hesitated. I wanted to lie. I wanted to tell him that this was a mistake, that it would never happen again. But I couldn't, because I didn't regret it. Not even a little. A dangerous addiction. That was the moment I realized this wasn't going to be a one-time thing. I had crossed the line and there was no going back. I didn't just want Jake. I wanted more. I wanted to see how far I could push this, how much I could get away with before the guilt finally caught up with me. And that terrified me, because the way he looked at me, the way we fit together so perfectly, made me wonder if I even wanted to stop. I didn't stop. I told myself I would. After that first time with Jake, I spent hours standing in the shower, letting the water scald my skin, as if I could wash away the weight of what I had done. But nothing changed. The guilt never came, the regret never settled in. Instead, all I could think about was him, the way he felt against me, the way his lips moved over my skin, like he had been waiting forever to taste me. So when he texted me again, I answered. And when he showed up at my door late at night, I let him in. We fell into a rhythm. My husband left for work in the morning, and by the afternoon, Jake was at my house. Sometimes it was hurried, rushed in between stolen moments before I had to make dinner. Other times, it was slow, drawn out, the kind of intimacy that made me ache when he left. The more I saw him, the less I thought about my husband, the less I cared about getting caught. Every touch, every kiss, every whispered promise pulled me deeper into something I couldn't control. I started leaving my door unlocked when I knew he was coming. Started wearing things I knew would drive him crazy. It was a game, one we were both playing without ever saying the rules out loud. But I should have known better. I should have known that nothing stays a secret forever. The first sign of trouble came unexpectedly. My husband sat across from me at dinner, his fork paused halfway to his mouth. His eyes were on me, studying me in a way he hadn't in years. "You seem different." I forced a smile, taking a sip of wine to steady myself. "Different how?" He shrugged, setting his fork down. "I don't know, distracted. Like you're somewhere else." My stomach twisted. For a moment I thought he knew, that he had figured it out. But then he sighed and ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "I'm probably just overthinking. Work's been stressful and I've been gone so much. Maybe we just need some time together." I nodded, pretending to agree, but the thought of spending time with him made my chest tighten, because all I could think about was Jake. Later that night, when my husband was asleep, I slipped out of bed and checked my phone. A message from Jake was waiting for me. "I need to see you." I should have said no. I should have ignored it, turned off my phone, and crawled back into bed beside my husband. But I didn't. I grabbed my robe and crept downstairs, unlocking the door just enough for Jake to slip inside. His hands were on me the second the door clicked shut, his mouth claiming mine in a kiss that left me breathless. "We shouldn't," I whispered against his lips, my body already betraying me. "I don't care," he murmured, lifting me into his arms. "I don't want to stop." Neither did I. We barely made it to the couch before he was pulling at my robe, his hands greedy, desperate. I lost myself in him, in the way he made me feel like the only woman in the world. But then a sound shattered everything. The creak of the stairs. My blood turned to ice. I barely had time to shove Jake off me before my husband's voice rang out. "What the hell is this?" I turned, my stomach lurching as I saw him standing in the doorway, his face twisted in something between shock and rage. Everything fell apart in an instant. My husband stood there, his face frozen in an expression I had never seen before. Shock, anger, betrayal. It all flickered across his features in rapid succession. My heart pounded so hard I thought I might pass out. Jake stiffened beside me, his body tensed like he was ready to fight or flee. But there was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The secret was out. My husband's eyes moved between us, from my disheveled robe to Jake's still warm presence beside me. The air crackled with tension, thick enough to choke on. "Say something," he finally muttered, his voice eerily calm. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. What could I say? That it was a mistake? That it didn't mean anything? That would be a lie. Jake took a small step forward. "Look, man." "Shut up," my husband snapped, his voice sharp, cutting through the room like a knife. Jake clenched his jaw, but he obeyed. I forced myself to take a shaky breath, wrapping my robe tighter around myself like it could somehow shield me from the reality crashing down around me. I'm sorry." My husband let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "You're sorry?" His voice was incredulous, like he couldn't even believe the words coming out of my mouth. "You're sorry that I walked in on my wife screwing the next-door neighbor in our living room? Or are you sorry that you got caught?" The words sliced through me, sharp and unrelenting. Jake took another step forward. "This isn't just her fault," he said, his voice tense. I said, "Shut up," my husband's voice boomed, echoing off the walls. "You don't get to stand here in my house and defend yourself. Get out." Jake hesitated, his gaze flickering to me. "Are you—" "Leave," I whispered, not looking at him. "Please." He didn't argue. With one last look in my direction, he grabbed his jacket from the floor and left, the door clicking shut behind him. And then it was just us. Silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I forced myself to meet my husband's gaze. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, his chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. His eyes, usually filled with warmth, were now unreadable. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse. I swallowed hard. "A few weeks." He let out a shaky breath, his hands running through his hair. "A few weeks," he repeated, as if saying it out loud would help him make sense of it. God, I don't even know what to say to you." I took a step closer, desperate to reach for him, to make him understand, even though I didn't understand it myself. "I never meant—" "Don't," he said, holding up a hand. "Don't say you didn't mean to. You meant to every time you let him in, every time you touched him." Tears burned in my eyes, but I blinked them back. "I loved you," he whispered, his voice barely audible, a sob caught in my throat. "I still love you." He shook his head, laughing bitterly. "No, you don't. If you did, you wouldn't have done this." I had no argument, because maybe he was right. Maybe love wasn't enough. He exhaled sharply and walked toward the door, grabbing his keys off the table. "Where are you going?" I asked, my voice small. "Away," he said without looking back. "Because if I stay here right now, I don't know what I'll do." And then, just like that, he was gone. The house was silent. And for the first time since this all started, regret settled in. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, the echoes of my husband's footsteps still lingering in the air. The door had slammed behind him minutes ago, but I hadn't moved. I couldn't. My body felt paralyzed, stuck between the weight of what had just happened and the terrifying realization that there was no undoing it. Jake was gone. My husband was gone. And I was standing in the wreckage of the life I had just destroyed. I sank onto the couch, the same couch where everything had spiraled out of control, where I had let myself fall into temptation over and over again. I gripped the edges of my robe like they could hold me together, but nothing could fix this. I had made a choice, a series of choices, and now I was standing in the aftermath, drowning in it. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The house was too quiet, too empty. I checked my phone, but there was nothing. No messages from Jake, no calls from my husband. I had never felt so alone. I wanted to cry. Maybe I thought if I could just let myself break, if I could shed enough tears, it would wash away the betrayal, the guilt, the undeniable ache that had settled deep in my bones. But no tears came. Instead, I sat there, staring at the ceiling, letting the weight of my actions press down on me until I could barely breathe. I thought about the moment it all started, that first touch, that first kiss. The way it felt to be wanted, to be seen. I thought about my husband, the way he had looked at me tonight, like I was a stranger, like I was someone he could no longer recognize. I thought about Jake. Had he gone back to his house? Was he thinking about me, or was he already moving on, shaking off the guilt like it was nothing? I stood up abruptly, my legs shaky beneath me. I needed to do something. I needed to fix this, if it even could be fixed. I grabbed my phone again and dialed my husband's number. He rang, and rang, and rang. Then his voicemail clicked on. I took a shaky breath, hesitating before I spoke. "Please come home." My voice cracked, barely above a whisper. "I know I don't deserve it. I know I broke us. But please, just come home." I hung up before I could say anything else. I didn't expect a response. I didn't deserve one. I curled up on the couch, staring at the front door, hoping, praying that he would walk back through it, that somehow he could find it in himself to forgive me. But deep down, I knew. Some mistakes can't be undone, and some doors once closed never open again. The sun was rising by the time I finally moved. I had spent the entire night on the couch, curled up in the blanket of my own silence. My body ached, stiff from the hours of stillness, but it was nothing compared to the emptiness inside me. My husband never called back. Jake never texted. The house felt different now. It wasn't just the absence of my husband's presence. It was the absence of everything. The warmth, the love, the illusion of security I had convinced myself I still had. I got up slowly, forcing myself into the kitchen. I made coffee like it was any other morning, but the routine felt hollow. The sound of the coffee machine humming, the scent of freshly brewed liquid filling the air, these were things I used to love. Now, they were just reminders of the normalcy I had destroyed. I sipped my coffee, staring out the window. The neighborhood was waking up. A jogger passed by, a woman walked her dog, and across the street, a father loaded his kids into the car for school. Life was still moving, but mine had stopped. A sudden knock at the door made me jump, my stomach twisting into knots. For one brief, foolish second, I hoped it was my husband, that maybe, after a night of thinking, he had decided to come back, to talk, to try. I rushed to the door and pulled it open, but it wasn't him. Jake stood on my porch, his hands in his pockets, his eyes dark, unreadable. He looked different now. Not the same Jake who had kissed me like I was the only woman in the world. Not the same Jake who whispered promises in the dark. This Jake looked uncertain, hesitant, maybe even regretful. I swallowed hard, gripping the doorframe. "What are you doing here?" He shifted his weight, exhaling sharply. "I wanted to check on you. I let out a dry, humorless laugh. Check on me? I shook my head. What's there to check on, Jake? My husband's gone. He probably isn't coming back. I burned my marriage to the ground, and for what? His jaw tightened, and for a moment he said nothing. Then, quietly, I didn't mean for this to happen like this. I blinked at him, a bitter taste filling my mouth. Like this, I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. What did you think was going to happen? That we could just keep sneaking around forever? That we could live in this fantasy world where no one got hurt? He looked away, guilt flickering across his face. I don't know, he admitted. I wasn't thinking about that. Of course you weren't. Silence stretched between us. I should have been angry at him. I should have blamed him. But the truth was, this wasn't his fault. It was mine. I was the one who made the choice. I was the one who let this happen. Jake wasn't the villain in this story. It was. I stepped back, gripping the edge of the door. You should go. His eyes snapped back to mine. Wait. Go, Jake, I said, my voice breaking. This was a mistake, all of it. His face hardened, but he nodded. Without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the driveway, back toward his house. I watched him go, the weight of my choices pressing down on me like a boulder. I closed the door, locked it, and leaned against it, exhaling shakily. The reality was settling in now. Jake was gone. My husband was gone. And I was left with the wreckage. Maybe he'd come back. Maybe he wouldn't. But no matter what happened next, one thing was clear. I had no one to blame but myself, and I would have to live with that. The days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next with no sense of time or purpose. The house, once filled with the familiar sounds of my husband's presence, the clink of his coffee cup in the morning, the rustle of his papers, the distant hum of his voice on the phone, was now silent. I had texted him a few more times, each message more desperate than the last, but he never responded. The silence was his answer. Jake hadn't reached out either, not that I expected him to. Whatever we had shared had been reckless, fueled by passion and bad decisions. I couldn't even let myself think about him now. His absence was another ghost in my home, another reminder of everything I had lost. I didn't leave the house much. Going outside meant facing the world, the neighborhood, the possibility of running into him, or worse, running into someone who knew. I felt like the floor had been ripped out from under me. So this was it, the moment I had been dreading. I knew it was coming, but seeing it in writing made it real in a way I wasn't prepared for. I wanted to reply. I wanted to beg him to talk to me, to let me explain, to try to make him understand. But what was there to understand? I had betrayed him. No amount of words would ever change that. So I didn't respond. Instead, I did the only thing I could do. I got up and started gathering his things. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the neatly packed bags, my chest tight. A knock at the door broke the silence. I didn't move right away. I just sat there, frozen, because I knew that once I opened that door, it would be over. But I had no choice. I forced myself to stand, to walk through the house one last time, with him still in it. When I opened the door, he was standing there, looking at me with eyes that no longer held love, only distant. I stepped aside, and he walked past me without a word. He moved through the house with a quiet efficiency, picking up his bags, gathering whatever else he needed. I wanted to say something. I wanted to apologize one more time, to tell him that I never meant for this to happen. That I never wanted to hurt him. But I knew it wouldn't matter. When he finally turned to leave, he paused at the door. For the first time since he walked in, his eyes met mine. For a second, I thought maybe, just maybe, he would say something. Maybe he would give me some sign that there was still hope, that there was still a chance. But all he did was nod, a small, final nod, and then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, and with it the last piece of my old life disappeared. I sank onto the couch, staring at the door, my heart aching in a way I couldn't even describe. This was what I had chosen. This was what I had done, and now I had to live with it.